In a quiet, smoke-filled room in the south of England, as the spring of 1944 bled into a tense and uncertain summer, a single man sat with a pen and a slip of paper. He was not a king, nor a prime minister, but for a few fleeting hours, he held the fate of the Western world in the palm of his hand. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and on that small note, he was writing a ghost story, a story of failure. It read in part, "Our landings have failed. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded it and tucked it away in his wallet. A private admission of a public catastrophe that had not yet happened. A specter of a future that must not come to pass. This small private act of ultimate responsibility is where our story begins. Because to understand the colossal weight of that potential failure, you must first understand the impossible machine built to achieve success. We speak of D-Day, of June 6th, and we see images of men wading through blood-red surf, of Higgins boats dropping their ramps into a wall of machine gun fire. We see the courage, the sacrifice, the terrible, intimate violence of it. But that is only the final, bloody punctuation mark on a sentence that had taken years to write. The story of D-Day is not just the story of the 156,000 men who crossed the English Channel on that single day. It is the story of how an entire civilization harnessed its collective will, its industrial might, and its organizational genius to support them. It is the story of history's greatest logistical nightmare. By 1944, the European continent had become a fortress. From the northernmost fjords of Norway down to the Spanish frontier, Adolf Hitler had built his Atlantic Wall. It was a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and steel, a jagged scar of gun emplacements, pillboxes, minefields, and barbed wire stretching for thousands of miles. It was designed not merely to repel an invasion, but to make the very thought of one a suicidal fantasy. Behind this wall, a darkness had settled. Millions lived under the heel of occupation, and millions more were being systematically exterminated in the heart of the Reich. To the east, the Soviet Union was engaged in a war of annihilation on a scale that beggars belief, trading millions of lives for miles of scorched earth, begging its Western allies to open a second front. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding diplomatic and moral weight. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break in the West. And in the small island nation of Great Britain, the storm had been gathering for years. The entire country had been transformed into a vast, unsinkable aircraft carrier, a colossal staging ground for the liberation of a continent. The quiet, winding lanes of the English countryside, once disturbed only by the passing of a farmer's cart, now groaned under the weight of Sherman tanks. Ancient pastures and public parks disappeared beneath seas of canvas tents, mountains of ammunition crates, and sprawling depots of fuel drums. The sky, once the domain of larks and swallows, thrummed with the constant drone of Lancasters and Liberators, of Spitfires and Mustangs. The population of entire counties was suddenly doubled by the arrival of millions of Allied servicemen. In the pubs of quaint villages, the accents of Kansas, of Ontario, of Warsaw, and of Sydney mingled with the local dialects. Britain had become a coiled spring, wound tighter and tighter with each passing day, storing the kinetic energy of the free world, ready to unleash it across the narrow, treacherous strip of water that separated hope from tyranny. But how do you move this world you have built? How do you transport a city of soldiers, with all its needs and appetites, across a hostile sea and deposit it onto an even more hostile shore? Courage can get a man up a beach, but courage cannot fire a rifle without a bullet. It cannot drive a tank without gasoline. It cannot heal a wound without a bandage or a dose of plasma. It cannot sustain a soldier through a day of fighting without food and water. Victory, the planners knew, would not be a matter of bravery alone. It would be a matter of arithmetic, of tonnage, of supply. This is the central, unglamorous, and utterly vital truth of Operation Overlord. For every soldier who was to land in Normandy, a vast invisible pyramid of support had to be constructed behind him. And the sheer scale of it is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. The invasion required nearly 7,000 naval vessels, from the mightiest battleship to the smallest landing craft. More than 11,000 aircraft were needed to command the skies. But these are just the fighting machines. Consider the things they needed. Over 20 million tons of supplies were shipped from the United States to Britain in preparation. Enough clothing was issued to outfit the entire population of a major city. The planners had to calculate the need for everything, down to the last button and bootlace. They needed maps. Hundreds of cartographers worked in secret, creating over 3,000 separate, minutely detailed maps of the landing zones, using aerial reconnaissance and even holiday postcards gathered from the British public to pinpoint every German machine gun nest, every ditch, every single farmhouse. They needed to know the weather, turning meteorologists into prophets whose forecasts could decide the fate of thousands. They needed intelligence, relying on the quiet, unimaginable bravery of French resistance fighters who counted train cars and paced out the thickness of concrete walls, sending their findings back to London via crackling, clandestine radio transmissions. And then there was the mundane, the things no one writes poems about. 5 million gallons of water had to be ready for the first 20 days. How much toilet paper does an army of 156,000 men use? Someone had to calculate it, procure it, and figure out how to get it ashore. They needed 14 million K-rations, those wax-coated boxes of processed cheese, biscuits, and cigarettes that would be the first meal for many on French soil. They needed 45,000 tons of ammunition for the first few days alone, in hundreds of different calibers, for dozens of different weapon systems. They needed blood, a river of it. A revolutionary system for collecting and storing blood plasma was created, ensuring that a wounded soldier in Normandy could receive a life-saving transfusion of blood donated weeks earlier by a factory worker in Ohio. Every pint was a miracle of science and logistics. This was a war fought by quartermasters and engineers as much as it was by riflemen. They had to invent solutions to problems that had never existed before. The Allies had no major port in Normandy. The Germans knew this and had fortified Cherbourg and Le Havre, believing them to be the only viable targets. So the Allies decided to bring their own ports with them. They constructed 2 massive artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, made from colossal concrete caissons and floating roadways, to be towed across the channel and assembled under enemy fire. It was an idea of such breathtaking audacity that it bordered on madness. It was the equivalent of building the Panama Canal and then sailing it across an ocean in the middle of a war. This entire sprawling enterprise, this organism of almost infinite complexity, depended on a single fragile thing, the plan. A document that grew to be thousands of pages long, a bible of timetables, shipping manifests, and operational orders. A single misplaced decimal point, a single ship arriving at the wrong beach at the wrong time, a single miscalculation of the tide could cause a catastrophic chain reaction, unraveling the whole intricate tapestry. And so, as Eisenhower sat with his note of failure, this was the machine he was setting in motion. A machine whose every gear and cog represented a life, a family, a future. A machine built not just of steel and gunpowder, but of human ingenuity, boundless hope, and the terrifying, crushing arithmetic of war. The men on the beaches were only the leading edge of a tide of material unlike anything the world had ever seen. Their fight for a few hundred yards of sand was the culmination of a global effort, a logistical Everest that had to be climbed before a single shot could even be fired. This tide of material was not an abstraction. It was a physical reality measured in crushing weight and explosive potential. The arithmetic began with the individual soldier. Planners calculated that each man ashore would require approximately 6.6 pounds of supplies per day to remain a functioning combatant. That number accounted for everything from his sea rations, meticulously engineered, to provide 4,300 calories for a body burning through energy at a ferocious rate, to the 30.06 cartridges in his M1 Garand, the morphine syrette in his first aid pouch, and even his share of the toilet paper. Multiply that by 156,000 men on the first day, and the initial requirement exceeded 1 million pounds of sustenance and material. By D+30, with the beachhead expanding, that daily tonnage was projected to swell to over 25,000 tons every single day. This was a war of consumption on an industrial scale. To feed this insatiable appetite, the engineers had to first solve the problem of the port. The Mulberry harbours were not a single invention, but a system of interlocking miracles. The outer breakwater, codenamed Gooseberry, was formed by sinking a line of 70 obsolete merchant ships and warships, a ghost fleet sacrificed to tame the channel's notorious chop. Inside this protective shield, the harbour itself took shape. Its core components were the Phoenix caissons, colossal hollow boxes of reinforced concrete, some as large as a 5-story apartment building and weighing over 6,000 tons. Built in dry docks across Britain, their construction consumed 330,000 cubic yards of concrete and 31,000 tons of steel. They were floating monoliths, crewed by royal engineers who lived inside their hollow chambers for the journey across the channel before valves were opened and the giants were scuttled with pinpoint precision onto the seabed. Connecting these concrete islands to the shore was a 10-mile-long network of floating roadways, codenamed Whales. These were not simple pontoon bridges. Each section was a marvel of articulation, designed to rise and fall with the 20-foot Normandy tides. They rested on beetle pontoons, moored to the sea floor with elaborate anchors, and were connected to pierheads called spuds, which could adjust their height by standing on 4 massive steel legs that telescoped down to the seabed. It was a city of steel and concrete, rising from the waves, designed, fabricated, and delivered in less than 9 months. The entire apparatus required more steel than was used to build the Golden Gate Bridge, and its assembly, under the nose of German artillery, remains one of the greatest feats of military engineering in human history. But a port is useless without the lifeblood of a modern army: fuel. The initial landings would be supplied by tens of thousands of 5-gallon jerrycans, a logistical nightmare of manpower and vulnerability. A single stray tracer round could turn a supply dump into an inferno. The long-term solution was even more audacious than the portable harbours. It was codenamed Pluto, for pipeline under the ocean. Engineers from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company developed 2 types of pipeline. The first, known as Hayes, was essentially a hollow armoured electrical cable, 3 inches in diameter and made of extruded lead, that could be coiled into the hull of a cable-laying ship. The second, Hamel, was a more rigid but still flexible 3-inch steel pipe that could be wound around massive floating drums like thread on a spool. These drums, called conundrums, were 60 feet in diameter and weighed 1,600 tons when full of pipe. Towed by tugboats, they would simply unspool their cargo along the seabed. From pumping stations cleverly disguised as gravel pits, seaside bungalows, and even an ice cream parlor on the Isle of Wight, a torrent of fuel would be pushed under 70 miles of enemy-controlled water directly to Cherbourg. By the time the operation was fully functional, 17 of these pipelines were laid, creating a subterranean, subaquatic circulatory system that pumped over 172 million gallons of gasoline by war's end. It eliminated the need for thousands of vulnerable tanker ship crossings, and it kept the Allied armoured divisions, which could consume 500,000 gallons of fuel in a single day of hard fighting, moving toward Germany. On the beaches themselves, this industrial might manifested as a steel menagerie of strange beasts, the specialized armor designed to crack the Atlantic Wall. These were Hobart's Funnies, the brainchild of Major General Percy Hobart. There was the Sherman Crab, a standard M4 Sherman tank fitted with a rotating boom and heavy chains that flailed the ground ahead, deliberately detonating mines at a rate of 3 acres per hour. There was the Churchill Havre, armoured vehicle Royal Engineers, a heavily armoured tank whose main gun was replaced with a 290mm Spigot mortar. It fired a 40-pound, unguided projectile filled with high explosive, nicknamed the Flying Dustbin, that could demolish a concrete pillbox in a single devastating shot. Another variant, the Churchill Crocodile, towed a 400-gallon armoured trailer of jellied gasoline, projecting a jet of liquid fire over 100 yards to incinerate enemy positions. To bridge anti-tank ditches, there were arc tanks, which carried their own extendable ramps, sacrificing themselves to become a bridge for others. To cross soft sand, there were bobbin tanks, which unrolled a 10-foot wide carpet of reinforced canvas ahead of them, creating a solid path for the thousands of vehicles that would follow. Every single one of these machines, every vehicle from the 2.5-ton DUKW amphibious truck to the 10-ton M4 tractor, had to be waterproofed. This was an immense, greasy, painstaking process. Each tank, truck and jeep was treated with a special asbestos and tar compound called Wademec. Every seam, every hatch, every air intake was sealed. Massive steel funnels were attached to engine exhausts and air intakes, allowing them to breathe while submerged. For tanks, a collapsible canvas screen was erected around the hull, turning the 30-ton war machine into a temporary boat propelled by its own tracks. The failure of a single seal, a single tear in the canvas, meant a multi-ton vehicle sinking to the bottom of the channel, often taking its crew with it. This was the brutal, unforgiving calculus of the invasion. Every ounce of ingenuity, every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel was merely a bet, a calculated risk stacked against the unforgiving laws of physics and the violent chaos of war. But for the individual soldier, the cog in this immense machine, the calculus was far simpler and infinitely more brutal. Once his boots touched the blood-soaked sand and he pushed inland, the grand, elegant designs of logistics began to fray. The meticulously planned supply chains, so perfect on paper in London, stretched and snapped across the flooded fields and narrow, sunken lanes of Normandy. Here in the dense, claustrophobic hedgerow country known as the Bocage, the war ceased to be about grand strategy and became a primal struggle for inches of ground. And for the men fighting it, the greatest logistical nightmare was not a shortage of tanks or artillery, but the agonizing lack of the most basic elements of human survival. The plan had called for a rapid breakout, for armies to be on the move, supplied by fast-moving truck convoys. The reality was a stagnant meat-grinding front, where an entire division could spend a week fighting for a single field. The supply lines became choked. A dirt road that was supposed to carry hundreds of tons of supplies per day might be interdicted by a single, well-hidden German 88mm gun, a silent predator that could turn a column of trucks into a junkyard of burning steel in minutes. The result, for the man at the tip of the spear, was a slow, creeping starvation. A soldier's world, once filled with thoughts of home and the future, could shrink to the size of a K-ration box. Inside was a day's sustenance, a small tin of processed meat or cheese, a handful of hard biscuits, a fruit bar, a pack of 4 cigarettes, and a stick of chewing gum. For a day or two it was a novelty, but after a week, a creeping dread set in. The men were fighting one of the most intense battles in history on a diet of roughly 2,900 calories a day, while burning close to 4,000. They were wasting away in their foxholes, the cold, greasy hash eaten straight from the can with a dirty finger or a bayonet tip turned the stomach. The biscuits were so hard they were nicknamed dog biscuits or John Wayne's teeth, capable of breaking a molar. The famed D-bar, a chocolate bar formulated to resist melting, was so dense and bitter that soldiers had to shave slivers off it with a knife just to make it edible. Men dreamed of hot food with a religious fervor. The memory of a simple plate of eggs, of a hot cup of coffee that didn't taste of gasoline from the can it was boiled in, became a tormenting obsession. A lucky soldier might find an intact apple orchard and risk sniper fire for the taste of something fresh, something not sealed in wax paper and tin. And, for most, there was only the constant gnawing emptiness in the pit of the stomach, a physical weakness that made lifting a rifle feel like lifting a log, and a mental fatigue that dulled the senses and slowed the will to fight. Then there was the rain. Normandy's summer was not one of gentle sunshine. It was a season of relentless, chilling downpours that turned the rich French soil into a thick, grasping mud that sucked at boots and swallowed equipment. For the infantryman, there was no escape. His home was a hole in the ground, a slit trench or a foxhole, and when the rain came, his home became a shallow, watery grave. He would sit for hours, sometimes days, in chest-deep cold water, his uniform a sodden, heavy shroud. The concept of being dry became a distant, almost unimaginable luxury. At night, the cold seeped into his bones, a deep, chattering cold that no amount of shivering could ward off. His feet, submerged constantly in the muddy water inside his leather boots, began to swell and rot. Trench foot, a relic of the First World War, returned with a vengeance, turning feet purple and black, causing skin to slough off and filling the trenches with the gangrenous stench of decay. A man could survive a near miss from a mortar. He could patch a shrapnel wound, but this relentless, creeping misery of being cold and wet day after day, week after week, eroded the spirit in a way no single moment of terror could. It was a quiet, relentless assault on a man's soul. And in this state of hunger and misery, he was expected to fight. But even the will to fight means nothing without the tools. The most terrifying sound in the bocage was not the scream of an incoming shell or the chatter of a German MG-42 machine gun. It was the soft, metallic ping of an M1 Garand rifle ejecting its empty 8-round clip. In that moment of echoing silence, a soldier was utterly vulnerable. The hedgerows ate ammunition at a terrifying rate. A 10-minute firefight to cross a single 50-yard field could exhaust a rifleman's entire combat load. Squad leaders began rationing violence itself. Don't fire unless you see a target. Make every shot count. But the enemy was often invisible, a ghost in the thick green maze, and the instinct to send a stream of lead toward a muzzle flash was overwhelming. The resupply was a life-or-death gamble. A jeep laden with ammunition cans would have to race down a lane zeroed in by German mortars. More often than not, it never made it. Soldiers became scavengers, crawling from hole to hole under fire, collecting single clips or loose belts from the dead and wounded. The bond between men was never stronger than when a soldier with a few rounds left would pass them to the bar gunner, the man whose automatic rifle was the squad's anchor. When the bar fell silent, the line often broke. There are accounts of entire platoons, their ammunition gone, being forced to fix bayonets and wait in their muddy holes for the inevitable German counterattack, armed with nothing but cold steel and a prayer. They were the best equipped army in the world, backed by the greatest industrial engine in history, and yet here on this small patch of earth, they were reduced to the level of medieval peasants, fighting with what they could find, their greatest weapon not their rifle, but the desperate, stubborn refusal to give up. The great machine of liberation had a ghost in its gears, and it was the spirit of the common soldier, running on fumes, shivering in the rain, and counting his last few rounds. The logistical nightmare wasn't about the failure to move mountains of steel. It was the failure to deliver a hot meal, a dry pair of socks, and a full clip of ammunition to the one man who needed it most. Here, the true cost was measured in the slow erosion of the soul. One cold meal, one wet night, one empty clip at a time. The stalemate had a sound. It wasn't the roar of artillery or the chatter of machine guns. It was a listening silence, the hum of insects in the humid air, the drip of water from a leaf onto a steel helmet. It was the sound of an army holding its breath, its heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For weeks, this was the sound of Normandy. The greatest invasion force ever assembled was trapped, held fast by a landscape that seemed to resent their very presence, a landscape that bled them of momentum, of supplies, of hope. Each hedgerow was a fortress wall, not of stone, but of earth and roots 1,000 years old, and behind each wall the defenders waited, patient and lethal. The great machine was not just stalled, it was beginning to rust in the rain. The turning point, when it came, was not born in a general's tent or a strategist's map room. It was born from the dirt and the frustration itself, an idea forged in the mind of a man who was tired of watching his friends die against those walls of green. His name was Curtis Culin, a sergeant from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He saw the problem not as a tactical puzzle, but as a physical one. You couldn't go around. You couldn't go over. So you had to go through. The idea was simple, almost primitive, the kind of brutal logic that war demands. He took the steel anti-tank obstacles the Germans had littered the beaches with, the things they called Czech hedgehogs, and suggested they weld the angled iron beams to the front of a Sherman tank, like tusks, iron teeth to chew through the earth. At first, the idea was dismissed, but desperation is the mother of invention. A few were built, tested in secret. They called them rhinos. A tank, fitted with these crude fangs, rumbled toward a hedgerow. It didn't delicately climb it or try to push it over. It plunged into it. With a scream of tearing roots and groaning steel, the tank ripped a hole straight through the ancient embankment, bursting into the field on the other side, with its guns already blazing. It was a horrifying, magnificent sight. The beast had grown claws. On July 25, 1944, under the cover of the most powerful aerial bombardment ever seen, the stalemate broke. Operation Cobra was unleashed. Thousands of tanks, a significant portion now fitted with the Rhino device, charged the German lines. They didn't flow like water finding a path of least resistance. They gored their way through the landscape. The sound that had been a listening silence became a deafening, continuous roar of engines and explosions. The earth itself seemed to scream as it was torn asunder. For the German defenders, it was a psychological collapse. Their greatest ally, the terrain, had been rendered useless. The impenetrable maze was suddenly full of holes, and through each hole poured a torrent of American steel. The great machine, once clogged and sputtering, was now unjammed. And with movement came lifeblood. The logistical nightmare began to recede, not because a new port was opened, but because the arteries to the front were finally clear. The jeeps could finally run. The trucks could finally roll. And on them came the things that turn a collection of desperate men back into an army. Water. Food. Mail from home. And ammunition. Crates and crates of it. The sublime, beautiful sight of a full ammo can being passed down a trench line. The weight of it was the weight of possibility, the weight of survival. The whisper of "make every shot count" was replaced by the thunder of suppressive fire. The bar gunner could once again become the anchor, laying down a curtain of lead that allowed his men to move, to fight, to live. The promise made on the beaches, the promise of overwhelming material superiority, was finally being kept in the muddy fields of the bocage. And when the thunder of the guns moved east, toward Paris, a new kind of silence fell over Normandy. It was not a silence of suspense, but of exhaustion. The land itself bore the wounds. Fields were no longer delineated by ancient green walls, but by the raw, brown scars where the rhinos had torn through. The copses of trees were splintered and skeletal. Ponds and streams were gone, filled in or rerouted by the geometry of violence. An entire ecosystem, centuries in the making, had been rewritten in a matter of weeks. The French farmers who returned found a new and terrible harvest waiting for them. For decades their plows would turn up not stones but rusted shell fragments, unexploded mortar rounds, the steel teeth of a buried mine. They called it the Iron Harvest. They would find helmets with jagged holes, canteens pierced by shrapnel, a single boot, a belt buckle. Each object a silent testament to the boy who had carried it, a ghost in the soil of his final resting place. The hedgerows that remained were different now. They were no longer just property lines or windbreaks. They were monuments, they were tombs. You could stand beside one on a quiet summer evening and feel the memory in the soil, the weight of what had happened there. The land did not forget. In the end, the story of those 156,000 men is more than a story of battle. It is a story of a promise. Logistics is a cold word for what is, at its heart, a sacred promise from a nation to its soldiers, that they will not be sent to fight and die for want of a weapon, a bullet, a meal. In the hedgerows of Normandy, that promise was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The nightmare was not the scale of the invasion, but the fragility of the single thread connecting the vast industrial engine of a superpower to the lone rifleman shivering in a foxhole. The breakout, the brutal tearing of the land by the Rhino tanks, was the violent, desperate fulfillment of that promise. It reminds us that history's grandest victories are not won by sweeping arrows on a map, but are purchased in moments of profound vulnerability, measured in the currency of single clips of ammunition and the simple, stubborn refusal to yield. It was a logistical nightmare that ultimately proved a logistical miracle, a testament to the idea that the power of an army is not in its size, but in its ability to deliver strength to its smallest, most vital part, the single soldier, waiting for the counterattack with a prayer on his lips and at last a full magazine in his hands.